Good evening and welcome to the evening on day 8. I hope your sourdough starters are looking beautiful and bubbly and smelling lovely. And you can actually start to bake with them now. If it's looking nice and bubbly, it has risen at least 30, I'd say, to 50% above where you put your elastic, and is kind of domed on the top. So you could see some nice bubbles in the top has risen. It's given that sort of quilted effect. You could start baking with it. So I'm going to have a look at mine, and if they still look good, I'm going to bake with my gluten-free sourdough starters tomorrow and make a loaf of bread, sourdough bread that's gluten-free and hopefully just delicious. All right, let's go check them out. And looking at our regular sourdough starter, it's still lagging behind. I hope that yours is much more bubbly than mine at this point. And you can see the line there where it has risen and fallen. So the starter is now in its phase of the life cycle of the bacteria and yeast, where the yeast are starting to die off because it's becoming too acidic. And yeast do not like acidity. Bacteria do, though. And the lactic acid bacteria are creating the acetic acid and lactic acid, which is making it quite sour smelling. And as it gets a little bit older, this is called an old starter. So once it's gone past its peak activity, it has risen and fallen. That's because the yeast has now started to die off. And when the yeast eats, it produces the carbon dioxide that causes it to rise. So when we see it lowering, that means our yeast is starting to die off. And we obviously don't want that, as we want our bread to rise. That's the whole point in making this. So this is the reason why we want to feed our starter when it's at its peak activity. So when we see those signs that it has the dome top, it's risen up and it hasn't fallen yet and it doesn't smell sour. And this way we will be feeding it at its peak activity and keeping the yeast very happy and healthy and as most active as possible to give us the best rise to our bread. You can use an old starter, however, to make a loaf of bread. It will just make a very sour loaf. So we can talk about that later as well. And my starter still smells quite sweet. It's just a little bit sour, not too much. So it definitely is ready for a feed. So I'm going to keep the ratio the exact same as it was this morning. That way we can really give it a chance to see if it will work. So we're going to feed it in the same ratio of 3 parts of starter to 4 parts of flour and 4 parts of water. So I'm going to keep 60 grams of starter and feed it 80 grams of flour and 80 grams of water. And so let's go ahead and discard. And we will keep our 60 grams of starter. Like I said, you could keep 30 if you wish. We will tare our scale and then add the 80 grams of water. And like I said, 40 grams if you want to keep yours small. Tare our scale again and 80 grams of flour. Or if you're keeping it small, 40 grams. Give it a really good mix again, as usual, until it's all nice and incorporated. And you can start to bake with your discard if it's a little more active than mine. I'm going to wait until tomorrow, but if yours is a little more active, go right ahead. Clean your jar and do the jiggle test to make sure you have the right consistency. And it's already starting to bubble, so we're definitely on the right track. So now just cover your starter back up, place it in its snuggly spot, and check the level of your elastic. So remember, you can use your discard now as long as your starter is active. So I've put a lot of ideas, including these muffins, in the post below. And if you make something, I would just love to see how it looks. And we'll get together again in the morning and we'll feed our starters. May you have a really peaceful sleep. Good night.